I don't think Kelly's going to be here. She said Janet's not feeling real good. Oh, it's a bad move. Good morning. Oh, it's about time for us to begin our Bible class this morning. So glad that you're with us. So thankful that you've decided to be a part of our continued study as we continue to look at anger management. But before we dive into that, I want to make you aware of a few things, a couple things I'm sure you're already aware of, but just to remind you, 2 weeks from today, we'll begin our new quarter of Bible classes. And with that new quarter, of course, 3 new adult classes will start. Ken Wright's going to be teaching Revelation right here in the auditorium. Tammy Moss is going to be teaching a women's class in the daycare room, and I'm going to be teaching a men's class over next door in the classroom in the fellowship hall. So I know that you're all going to be in one of those 3 classes. I would just ask that you be encouraging those that are not currently around you to also make it a decision to be a part of one of our mini Bible classes as we continue to just strive to grow together and grow in our knowledge and love for God and our understanding of His Word. Also wanted to let you know that Janet East is not feeling very well this morning. Kelly sent me a text a little while ago about that, and so I want us to be mindful of Janet as she's not feeling very well. So good to see Brenda. So glad that she's with us today. She's been going with the Sojourners for quite a while and is only back in town for a short time and will be off again. And so we're excited for her and all the continued work that she's doing for God and just amazing things. Wonderful things being done by some wonderful people. Before we do enter into our time of study this morning, Brother Jimmy, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer? Amen. Amen. Also ask you to kind of keep in mind over the next few days. I know we have several from here. I think there's like 14 couples that are going to be gone next weekend. And so a lot of them will be traveling over the course of the next week to go to Gatlinburg together. I think there's 4 couples that have already gone up this weekend. And so 3 or 4 couples have already left, and they're already up there. So we'll have several who are going different places and just kind of be mindful of those. And I know with it being a 3-day weekend, I've heard of several others who have taken that 3-day weekend, taken advantage of that and are traveling here and there. So have a lot of places going, or a lot of people going a lot of different places. And I just want to be mindful of them and their safety as they travel as well. As we kind of continue our study through anger management here, in an ideal world, that is an ideal situation, healthy anger management is something that really is learned in our childhood. And ultimately, it's kind of redefined and it's grown and strengthened in us as adults. Unfortunately, that's ideally. Unfortunately, the reality is far too many of us as adults, we didn't learn how to properly handle our anger as children because we learned from the adults around us, who in turn had never properly learned how to handle it in their childhood. And so this vicious cycle becomes a very apparent thing in the lives of many people, where families do not know how to handle unhealthy anger. And you've probably seen it a time or two through the years, if not more, where a family can actually get labeled as being angry. Just maybe using a generic name like, well, those Smith families, man, those Smiths, they're just so angry. They come by it natural because his mama was angry. And, I remember her mom and she was angry. And so they just come by it natural. And so when we do that, we're kind of like giving them a pass that they can't help it. And I recognize there's a lot to the nature-nurture debate. But when it comes to unhealthy anger and dealing with it, it is much more of a learned behavior than a genetic issue. I mean, it's not like saying, well, they all have the same nose. You can tell they all belong to the same family because they look so much alike. That's genetic, okay? Unhealthy anger and dealing with it in unhealthy ways, that is much more a learned behavior. And so somebody, somewhere along the way, has to be man or woman enough to stand up and say no more. I'm going to break the cycle. I'm not going to continue to be who my family is. I'm not going to continue to act the way they act. I'm going to actually stand up and I'm going to do something different. In turn, I'm going to break the cycle. Proverbs 22 verse 6 tells us to train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he's old, he will not depart from it. Now, the application of that passage is numerous. But I also think for the practicality of our study, it could also be said, and should be said, that we should be trying to train up our children and our grandchildren even to be emotionally healthy so that as they grow old, they won't depart from it. In other words, they will be able to learn how to better handle their anger as children and then refine that as adults and grow stronger as adults. They won't depart from it. But a lot of that depends upon us. I think one of the greatest mistakes that parents of any generation, don't just blame young parents, this has been going on for a long time. I think one of the greatest mistakes that parents from any generation make is when parents allow the child to dictate the emotional boundaries of the family. In other words, the children become the ones who dictate the way the emotions are dealt with. We as parents and grandparents, we have good intentions. We hopefully all understand the need and have a desire to be firm yet fair in how we deal with our children, how we deal with our grandchildren. But when they fail to respond the way that we desire for them to respond, when they fail to act the way we think they should act, when they don't respond to us the way we expect for them to respond, oftentimes all of our good intentions, man, they just go right out the window. Like we just totally hang it up. That is called, by the way, having a reactor mentality within a parent. That's not a good thing, because having a reactor mentality means that you are reacting to what they're doing as opposed to them reacting to what you're doing. In other words, as a parent at that point, if you have a reactor mentality, you're handing the control over to them. When you as an adult, whether it be as a parent or grandparent or whomever the authoritative figure in the room is, you should be the one maintaining control. But when you react, when you overreact, you then are saying, here, you're really in charge, not me. And you are allowing the child then to, again, dictate the emotional agenda that is a part of that family environment. Now, to counter that, we as adults, man, we have to go on the initiative. Oftentimes, again, if we're going to break a cycle here, we've got to go on the initiative. And rather than always wondering and kind of questioning ourselves and saying, how can I get my kid to act in such a way, to behave in such a way that they won't make me so angry? It's time to change the question. It's not about how they can behave, how you can force them to behave so they don't make you mad. It's about how do I behave so that I can train them up in such a way that they will know how to behave. Because it begins with us. We're the adults in the room. We are the parents, we are the grandparents, we are the aunts, we're the uncles, we are the whomever. We are the adults. And if we're going to break the cycle of this unhealthy anger that is seen and perpetuated oftentimes from generation to generation, we have to change the question. It cannot be about how do I make them stop making me so mad. It has to be about what do I need to do, how do I need to behave so that I can help train them up in such a way that their behavior is as it should be. So what I want to share with you over the course of the next 2 weeks, I've divided these up into 2 sections because I want us to be able to not have to rush through them. But I've run across 6 ideas that hopefully will help us as adults learn how to break the cycle for the children that are in our lives so that this unhealthy anger is not continually handed down from one generation to the next. The first thing is this: don't be threatened by the child's anger. Don't be threatened by their anger. Now, you know, we saw several weeks ago now, I think it's probably, when I went back in my notes, it's probably about 6 weeks ago now. But about 6 weeks ago, we saw that unresolved fears can oftentimes result in a sense of defensiveness within us. All right, so a lot of times then that defensiveness shows itself in unhealthy anger. So if I feel threatened, then oftentimes this unhealthy anger is going to come out of me. So, are you afraid of your child's anger? Now, if you're like me, you might quickly say, I'm not afraid of my child. I run the house. I'm in control. I'm the one who's holding the reins. I am not afraid of my kid or my grandkid. Who would be afraid of their child? Well, while that may be your first instinct or first thought, and while you may not be experiencing fear in the sense that you cower in the corner when they walk in a room, but if you do easily get caught up in power plays, that is arguments with your child. Okay. Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of us would not disagree with that. Would not. But if you speak tensely to your child on a regular basis, then you probably are afraid, somewhat afraid, or threatened by your child's anger because you're exhibiting that defensiveness. When you discipline your child and you find that they are argumentative because they don't like the fact that they're in trouble, is there this feeling that's inside of you that kind of wants to boil to the surface of, how dare you talk back to me? I'm the adult, you're the child, I'm in control, I know what's best for you. How dare you? Whether or not you show it, if you feel that inside of you, then yes, you are threatened. And most of us have those feelings. Most of us struggle with those emotions. So, do you at times struggle with feeling threatened by the anger that your child may have? More than likely so. Now, why do kids get so argumentative? Because they're kids. That's why. We're adults. We're supposed to know better. They're children. On one hand, when it comes to kids, it's kind of a natural thing, I think, within all of them. On one level, they need our guidance, and I think we recognize that. I mean, and we know that. That's why we're trying to discipline them, and that's why we're trying to love them and trying to train them up in the way they should go. And kids know that. They know they need guidance internally. But then the conflict comes in. They're so self-absorbed. They're so consumed with themselves and what they want, they really don't want any of your input. And so it's this tug-of-war that's going on in a lot of kids, and quite frankly, a tug-of-war that continues in a lot of us as adults. Where when someone tries to offer us guidance we need, we know we need it, but we just don't want it. That's why a lot of us as adults, as Christians, we struggle with our Christianity, don't we? We struggle with doing what's right in the eyes of God. While God knows what's best for us, He has set boundaries for us. He puts them in place for us. Yet we don't all just jump up and say, praise God, I'm doing everything you told me to do, and I love it. We struggle with that in our spiritual life. So why is it any shock to us when our children struggle with that same thing as children? And so there's a part of that where that argumentativeness is natural. How we respond to it, that's everything. How we respond to it becomes what really sets the tone. Again, don't be threatened by it because they're just being normal. Now, does that mean that you need to let your boundaries down? Not at all. Not at all. You need to uphold your boundaries, whatever they are. If you have said that it's time to go to bed and they say, but I don't want to go to bed, it's still time to go to bed. Now, it doesn't mean that you give in those areas, okay? But it also doesn't mean that you feel the need because, you're the Superman in the house that you're going to squash any and all frustration right now. Yes, sir. Absolutely. 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 Question in our house that's always asked is, well, what did Mama say or what did Daddy say? When David comes to us and wants something, and we know that, and it happens on the regular, and we know that he's already had this conversation with the other, we just automatically refer back to the other. And Rebecca will say, well, what did your daddy say? Well, he said no. Well, there you go. And if he says to me, well, what did I say? What did Mommy say? But she said no. There you go. So, yeah, you've got to stand behind each other. I totally agree. You're in it's a team effort. And if they can work the two of you, they will. And they figure that out real quick. And may I say as a side note, a lot of times that's also as a learned behavior. Because they see us as adults doing that. They see us as adults being somewhat deceptive, and they see us working other people and going against the will and the wishes of the others in our life. So that too is something we need to be conscious of. But it is a very real thing. But again, we're talking about being threatened right now, okay? So I would encourage you to go to the checklist on your worksheet. And let's go through some of these things. And if you ever feel these things, ever feel these thoughts or emotions, check it. Just go ahead and put a check mark by it because nobody's going to see this but you. You say yes when you know it's best to say no. How many times in a family, how many times when a child is upset, how many times have parents with good intentions finally had enough and said, okay, fine, even though I said no. Oh, okay, fine. Well, don't do that. Again, whatever your boundaries are, stick to those boundaries, but stick to them with a tone that we'll talk about in a moment, a tone that is proper. Don't allow them to cause you to react because, again, you don't want to have that reactionary mentality. You want to be the one that's in control. So if you say no, then mean no. But it doesn't mean that you have to lower the boom the whole way through to make sure they understand what no means. Not always. All right, the second thing here is when a child challenges your ideas, you immediately speak with greater force. It's time to go to bed. I'm not ready to go to bed. I said go to bed! Is that really necessary? And then we wonder why they yell at us sometimes. Again, it's not because it just comes natural to them, and genetically speaking. It's because they've learned it. All right? So yes, ma'am. Sure. Absolutely. And as parents, we've lived longer. Hopefully, as godly parents, we know what God expects of us and of our children, and that's the boundaries we're trying to set for them. So absolutely, our kids need that. The second thing there, or third thing rather, you give excessive explanations for choosing a discipline. Do you feel the need to over-explain yourself? Do you feel the need that when you say no, to say, and this is why, and this is why, and this is why, and this is why, because you're just really trying to make sure they get it? Or is you just saying no or yes, and maybe with a simple explanation, is that good enough? Inwardly, you think, how dare they speak to me in that tone of voice? Again, as I said a moment ago, when they do kind of bow up a little, do you find yourself just getting that much more frustrated? Let's see, you're not sure your child takes you seriously when you say something. Do you walk away from a situation going, I know I told them no, but they're not going to listen to me. They're going to do it anyway. I know they are. They're not going to pay any attention to me. Then check that. You give in too easily to your child's whining or fussing, wanting peace at any cost. Don't do this. I know a lot of parents, far too many parents, that all in the name of peace will say, well, I just don't want everybody upset. I don't want everybody fussing. And so I guess we'll just go ahead and forget it. Don't do that. Don't do that. Now, again, there's a way to handle it, and there's a way to not handle it. But don't give in just because they're pushing you. The other day, David got his first conduct mark at school. And it's the first one he's gotten all through first grade and then getting in kindergarten. And so let's just say by the time he got in the car when I picked him up that day, he just came dragging. And he climbed in the car and he said, Daddy, you're going to have to ground me and spank me and I don't know what all. And I said, what for, bud? And he goes, I got a ticket pulled. And that means he got a conduct mark. I said, well, what were you doing? He goes, I was talking in the hall and she caught us. And I said, okay. And we've told David from day one, if you get in trouble at school, bud, there's going to be consequences at home too. And so he said, so what's my punishment? I said, well, listen, man, I don't think we're going to get a spanking, not this time. But there's going to be any TV or any playing on my phone tonight. Okay? And he says, okay. And he was just relieved there wasn't going to be a spanking, Well, we get home and he starts bebopping around. And what happens? Well, there's no TV. And there's no playing on my phone. And so he starts to get a little frustrated by this. And he says, well, Daddy, I've been thinking about it. And I don't know, I don't think it's fair. And I said, but you understood that there would always be consequences, and these are just consequences. I said, and you would have TV right now, buddy, if you hadn't been talking in the hall. And so I'm just trying to re-talk through everything. And finally, at one point, he just gets kind of frustrated. He walks away. He goes, I would never be this mean to my kids. And I said, buddy, I hope you're just as mean, And I just let him kind of walk off pouting. Now, far too many parents at that point, if not sooner, would say, buddy, you know what, you're right. I'm so sorry. Here, take the TV remote. Here's my phone, Here's $10 on top of it all. I'm so sorry that I made you feel bad. We can't do that because, again, we can't be afraid to set those boundaries and in a loving way actually uphold those boundaries. So don't be threatened the way that so many get threatened. Now, the more of those things that you might check on that checklist, basically what you're doing, it's an invitation to fight. Bugs Bunny used to say, them are fighting words, okay? And a lot of times in a family, this is where those arguments really begin and erupt. And when parents and kids, when adults and children are arguing, everybody loses. There is no winner, all right? It's the same way sometimes we may say that in a marriage when everybody's fighting and everybody's trying to win, everybody loses. Same way here. When the kid and when the adult, when everybody's fussing and fighting and yelling and screaming, nobody's coming out victorious. Nobody's going to come out the winner. Everybody in the situation ultimately loses. So then what can we do in those situations? What's the alternative? First of all, let your kid be human. That's hard for us. We expect our kids to be better than we. We hold our children on sometimes a higher standard than what we should, and that's not fair. All right? If David were to say that's not fair, he'd be right about that. Because all of us adults have had bad days. All of us as adults have moments of irritability, and if you say you don't, you're lying, and we'll offer the invitation in a short while, and you can respond to that. Now, in those moments where you've had bad days, or you didn't feel good, or you're a little irritable, Now, how did it go over with you for someone to fuss at you for how you were acting? Probably didn't receive it real well, did you? You probably didn't appreciate their tone. You probably thought to yourself, they can't tell me what to do. And why do we expect any different in the kids? Again, set boundaries, yes. Uphold those boundaries, yes. But also allow a little bit of flexibility for them to be human. Again, hold firm to that authority, though. Even if the kid doesn't really seem to understand why. And let's face it, more times than not, our kids don't understand why. And if we're honest, there are times that we look at the Word of God and the boundaries He has set for us, and we don't understand why. Sometimes the answer is not to know why, it's just to do. It's to obey, even if you don't completely understand all the whys. So if your words make sense, that means if you communicate with words what the discipline is and why it is, then should we not be allowing that to stand on its own? And not feeling like we have to make such a big show, a big display of it all. Because a lot of times when we finally do start to get over that initial shock, the initial threatening that we feel because of the anger that our child may be feeling, then we can begin to be a little more objective. Then we can begin to think with a little bit more fairness and reasoning. And Christian, stability and logic should be our guide, not knee-jerk emotion. Knee-jerk emotion is not going to get us the results that God wants us to have. So we need to be able to be mature enough to have a lot more of that stability and logic in our life than just reactionaries. Let choices and consequences shape the child. Again, sometimes as parents, I think we can be far too impatient to even allow our child the opportunity to learn the lesson that we're actually trying to teach them. If a child is rude, then we want them to stop, and we want them to understand why they need to stop, and we're going to tell them how to think, and we may even lecture them a little bit, and we may even tell them what the consequences will be if they don't stop acting that way. And again, how does that usually impact a child? A child then just becomes angry inwardly, if not outwardly, and again, that kind of rebellious spirit begins to form in them, where they, like so many of us, develop a spirit that says, well, you know what? You can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me what to think. If you think this is bad, I'll show you bad. And I mean, that attitude, that just begins to permeate, and it begins to grow within a person. And a lot of it comes down to just simply not allowing the kid to have choices. You know, one of the things that David can say that, I'll be honest, can get on my last nerve real fast, is when we're at the house and he says, Daddy, I'm so bored. I don't have anything to play with. And now the first time I can handle it. And, I'm like, oh, okay, it's all right, son. You got plenty of toys. But after a while, and you all know how kids can be. After a while, Daddy, I'm so bored. Oh, I don't have anything to play with. And it keeps going, and it keeps going until eventually I hit a point where I just want to say, and sometimes have been guilty of saying, son, you have more toys than a toy store. There's no reason that you should be bored. And if you have too many toys, maybe we should give a lot of your toys to kids who don't actually have toys so they can have something to play with. And y'all, you know what? Not once in his 6 years has David stopped and gone, Daddy, you're exactly right. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Thank you for helping me see a different perspective. And he's not going to. All right? So we need to be very conscious of these things. We need to be mindful of how our reaction then creates in them and sets a tone for who they're ultimately going to be. We're not doing any favors ultimately for our kids when we try to just force feed them to try to think for them and try to reason for them. They need to experience emotions. They need to learn how to deal with their emotions, so that as they grow older, they'll be more trained to deal with their emotions, like anger, in a healthy way, as opposed to just responding to the way they've always been told to respond. I mean, the end goal, ultimately, what we want, what our desire is to raise children who are happy and healthy, emotionally, spiritually, physically. We want them to be able to exist on their own and without being dependent upon everyone who is around them. And I know that choices and consequences, they're much, much more consuming for us as parents and for us as adults than just simply saying, this is the way it's going to be, this is what you're going to do because I'm telling you to do it. And sometimes, listen, sometimes that has its place. But the child will become much more mature, hopefully, if we're not just pushing them to think in a certain direction. Because they're going to struggle with who they are. They're going to struggle with their emotions the same way that we all do. And so we can't give in to that. Cindy, what was it wanted to say? Absolutely. Right. Right. Absolutely. Cause and effect, consequences, the consistency in that, all those things are so important. But oftentimes not, especially the consistency. The consistency is where more times than not we as human beings fail because it's not fun. And we know that. It's not fun having to be the adult in the room. It's not fun having to say no. It's not fun having to discipline, and even to the point of corporal punishment, where David says, "Oh, daddy, mommy or daddy just walked over toward the refrigerator. Don't get out the paddle because the paddle's on top of the refrigerator, and he knows where it's at." Okay, that's not fun. But if we want to try to train up children that are healthy and well, and hopefully don't react the same way that sometimes we struggle with reacting, then these things become of such great importance. The last thing today is don't preach. That sounds funny coming from me, but don't do it, man. If we are going to teach our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, whomever the children are that may be around us, if we are going to help train them up in such a way that they know how to deal with anger in a healthy way, then we have got to model it. We've got to model it in our own communication. Going back to the old adage of, you got to practice what you preach, all right? This time, don't worry about the preach part, just worry about the practice part. You make sure that however you want your child responding, that's how you're responding. You make sure that you are living that in front of them, that you are modeling that in front of them. Because again, if you're not, who are we to take this cop-out of saying, well, no, you just need to do what I say and not what I do? Because that's not going to get us anywhere. We've got to actually model the behavior that we want them to aspire to. That means, one of the things that means is we have got to say no to ironic phrases. You ever used an ironic phrase or had one used on you? Probably so, okay? Here's the way ironic phrases go. I'll use it on Ben. Ben, you think you're upset now? Oh, you give me a minute and I'll give you something to be upset about. You'll know what upset is. Now, y'all laugh at that, but you've probably said something like it or heard it at least. Now, you want to know the irony in that? In that condescending tone, you teach the very attitude you're trying to break. And what good does that do? You're mad? Boy, you better calm down or I'll give you something to be mad about. Boy, that should get you Parent of the Year. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, okay? So again, that kind of condescending tone, those kind of phrases, that is not going to get you the end result that you say you desire if you want to help train up the children who may be around you in your presence and looking to you as an example for what it means to be able to deal with their anger in a much more healthy way. When we are in that authoritative role as adults, the more low-key our response, I think the better. We don't ever need to forget the wisdom of Proverbs 15:1, that a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. A soft answer, a gentle tone, that turns away wrath. But that grievous, condescending, angry tone, buddy, all that does is stir up more anger. That just perpetuates it. All right? So then that tone becomes so important. In other words, as I heard somebody say a long time ago, the loudest dog in the room is usually nothing more than a nuisance. And that's true. I mean, I think if we're honest, while we may not want to be able to reflect upon our own self, there are probably people in our life or people we've come into contact with that we know, man, we know that they like to bark and they like to bark loud and they can get boisterous and they can get angry. And we know nobody really listens to them. We know we don't. We know nobody else around them really does. They may think everybody jumps when they say jump. But the truth of the matter is they don't have anybody's ear because they don't have anybody's respect because of how they act. Well, I went in and I said this, this, and this, and they did this, this, and this. Well, maybe they did. But you're not training. You're not teaching. You may be scaring. You may be perpetuating anger, unhealthy anger, by displaying it. But they're really not listening. You're really not teaching. You're really not training. So that low key becomes so very essential. So if we want the child, again, to grow up and to be able to deal with anger in a much more healthier way. I think with that also, before the last bell rings, I would have to ask myself, even if I'm okay with a lower key and a lower tone, maybe for you or for me, we don't show it in yelling, but maybe it comes out more in our insistentness on persuasive speech. You know, maybe we can keep a tone that's somewhat pleasing, but maybe our temptation is for our tongue to continually want to offer our rebuttals to whatever the point at hand is, or to work really hard to convince them of why they're wrong and why we are right. Or we want to rebut even the finest points of whatever their thinking is. Yes, Diane. Absolutely. Absolutely. Ephesians 6:4 goes along with that precisely. Absolutely. So, even in those disagreements that we all have, when we learn how to speak more respectfully, when we learn as adults to be the adults God has called us to be, even in the presence of the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, whomever it may be, even somebody else's kids that may be in our presence, we can help diffuse a lot of the anger that may already be there. Or we can help diffuse it before it ever starts. If we will learn the correct tone, and if we will learn how to be respectful. If we will learn how to take Proverbs 15:1 and make it a part of who we are and a part of our life, and not think that we always have to be the top dog who's the loudest dog who has control of the room. Because again, we don't. When that is our mentality, when that's our attitude, and this may be bursting your bubble this morning, but I'm not going to apologize for it if it is, because you need to learn to. Nobody's listening. They're not hearing you. They're not hearing me when we act in that way. So we have to learn a different approach, a more godly approach, a scriptural approach, if we're going to break the cycle. We'll pick up with the latter 3 points next week. Thank you all for your time and attention and for your comments.